Hey, what's up everyone? Thanks for coming back to my site. Welcome back. And this is another in my series of hopefully educational and informational videos on the topics broadly encompassing cognitive and affective neuroscience and the biological bases of human behavior. If you haven't seen my videos before or my intro video, my name is Alistair Taylor. I hold a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the Hawaii School of Professional Psychology, which is an APA or American Psychological Association accredited school. And as I mentioned in my intro video, it's basically just the site is about trying to create content that simplifies some of the complex science out there and tries to present it in a way that's practical and useful for people in their everyday lives. So this particular video is basically alludes to the topics of anxiety and depression and how they may develop over time. It's not explicitly saying very specific cause and effect, but it's a very related topic, and I think it's one of the ones that doesn't often get a lot of attention in the mainstream media when they talk about how depression and anxiety develop. So it's a slightly different perspective or approach to this. So to kick it off, what I'm going to do is show a video which is not my own. This is from Dr. Edward Tronick at UMass Boston. He's a social psychologist. I don't know personally, but I think this experiment is quite brilliant. It's not specifically about attachment theory, but it relates to attachment theory. It has some crossover with social signaling. And quick shout out to Potomac Behavioral Solutions and my colleagues over there when I did my internship pointed this video out to me. So I think it's only 2 minutes long, but it's extremely informative. I'll play it and then I will discuss a little around its ramifications. So here we go.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the other. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. Bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when the child any chance to get back to the good, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
All right, so let me unpack this a little bit. There's a lot of interesting stuff beyond the 2 minutes that we can observe. So one is if you understand a little bit about human development, that babies are born with their emotional systems essentially fully developed. They come into the world, they're able to express a wide range of emotion, they can experience emotion, they can reciprocate emotionally, they have happiness, sadness, anger, frustration, irritability, perhaps grief. The cognitive development, however, takes a lot longer to reach maturation. Basically, somewhere in your 20s is where peak maturation occurs. So in the beginning, a child may have the full emotional experience, and they may receive the full emotional brunt of a negative experience without the cognitive interpretation that explains why they might be feeling that way or why people in their environment are acting a certain way. So in the case of this baby, for example, what we notice is the baby reacts very quickly. It doesn't know what's wrong, but it knows something is awry. And you can see the facial expression kind of moves from concern to some anxiety to frustration pretty quickly. So in looking at the brain development, the brain develops in neuroscience terms, we say rostral to caudal, or caudal to rostral, which is from tail to head. That development from the lower brain regions, or the hindbrain, through the midbrain, and ultimately to the prefrontal cortex, which is where higher order cognitive processing takes place. The hindbrain regions are primarily responsible for autonomic functions such as breathing, respiration, heart rate, all these sort of automatic processes in the body that we don't really have to think about. Then the midbrain structures are primarily centers that regulate emotion and memory, such as the pituitary, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the hippocampus. These areas where emotion and memory are also tightly interwoven. It's one of the reasons why emotional memories tend to stick for so long, like these intense emotional experiences. Like for those of us that were alive when 9/11 happened, we can almost always remember exactly where we were and what we were doing when we heard about the news of that fateful day. So emotional experiences are pretty intense, and the forebrain, the prefrontal cortex, is essentially what regulates emotional experience. So as I'm saying here, the prefrontal regions of the brain are responsible for emotional regulation and the capacity for interpretation of emotional experiences. And what we can see with this video is the baby becomes disconcerted because it's feeling the emotional intensity, but it's not able to put an interpretation to it, not at this early stage of development. Another point is that the limbic system, these emotional centers of the brain, are significantly faster than the cognitive system in appraising threat, which is likely a survival mechanism, so that if you, for example, were walking along the road somewhere in the wilderness, sort of like a dirt road, hiking trail or something, and a snake slithers out, and your reaction to that is like almost instantaneous. You may freeze, you may jump back, your eyes will likely kind of wide open as your pupils dilate to take in more information about your environment. Your hair may bristle, your heart rate may accelerate, blood pressure may go up. This is all activation of the HPA, or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that sends your body into fight or flight mode. There isn't much cognitive appraisal. It's not like you're really trying to determine, I mean, for most people, I guess, unless you're a herpetologist that studies snakes, that you're not going to try to appraise like whether this is a deadly snake or it's a benign snake, or, you know, how far might it be able to spit? Are you in safe range? Is the snake even noticing you? All these other things, right? That's all for like later cognitive appraisal. So, you know, cognitive thinking, thought processes are just much slower. I mean, another example that you'd probably all be familiar with is just driving, right? If you're on a freeway and somebody swerves into your lane, your reaction is very quick. It's if you think about it, you're not really consciously aware of what you're doing. It's entirely automatic, and this is essentially just, like I mentioned, for survival, but also the way the brain works with learning, because you can imagine if things that we automated, like tying our shoelaces, if we had to learn that over and over again, life would be very cumbersome. And when the brain overlearns a certain behavior, we can do it without thinking about it. So you can tie your shoelaces and be planning your day and having a conversation with somebody else and watching what's happening outside the window all at the same time. It's not that hard. So this is just sort of the brain's model of efficiency with learning. So in going back to the baby's responses here, and we notice how quickly the behavior changed, the facial expressions change. And also, just to kind of describe anxiety in this context, I think anxiety can present in different ways, but what it summarily amounts to is that you have the sense that the world is kind of foreboding or unpredictable or dangerous in some way threatening, and or you lack the capacity to deal with it, the skills or the ability to overcome that danger, and that can be both at the same time or one or the other. I guess I should also just preface really quickly that, like I was saying, this is not specifically an attachment theory video, it's more social signaling. And what that is, for those that don't know, is attachment theory is a theory in psychology that encapsulates some evolutionary theory and ethological theory, the way humans and animals attach to caregivers in infancy. And this is purported to be critical to how creatures and humans both are able to build and form secure relationships. So not being insecure, not being clingy, not being worried that people are going to abandon them, just being able to be trusting and trustworthy in relationships. And we see in people that have this sort of childhood neglect, they tend to be it's almost like an anticipatory anxiety that they're going to be rejected a lot of times, or they don't expect to be loved and cared for. And then social signaling is essentially basically nonverbal behavior. And while I think many people have the idea that communication is essentially verbal, I would say that nonverbal communication is at least half of the picture, if not more. So I'll explain a little bit more about that as we move along. So next slide is, what's interesting with this video, one among many things, is that we look at the mom and she's not really doing anything antagonistic. She's not angry, she's not expressing aggressive behaviors, but the baby immediately detects that something's wrong. So this kind of lends insight into how powerful nonverbal cues can be and how quickly we pick up on them. So the baby's getting this full emotional experience right here. She doesn't know what's going on. She just knows something's not right. And I think one of the reasons that the anxiety sets in quickly is not just that the mom's behavior is unusual, but also that the mom is not responding in a way that the baby would predict based on a healthy relationship, such that if the baby smiles, the mom smiles back. If the baby points, the mom expresses interest in what she's pointing at. And I think this is where the roots of sort of self-confidence and autonomy are laid down, because a child that acts in this way and sees a reciprocal interest can see that the environment is interested in her, the baby, for example. Adults that are more competent and bigger and more powerful, as much as that may be, they're still interested in what this little baby has to say and what the baby is doing. And that gives the baby, I think, a strong sense of validation that what they say and do matters, that they are able to influence the environment in a predictable and a positive manner. And now all of a sudden that's taken away from them, and that's very, very scary for a child. So it's likely that the baby's frustration stems from the opposite of when the mom is engaged. This is to summarize what I kind of just said, that the interaction, the reciprocity, and it's predictable. And we can notice too that the baby recovers very quickly when the mom re-engages. But if this situation was repeated enough without resolution, learned helplessness might set in. So learned helplessness is a little bit of a tangent, but it's worth mentioning. So that was a theory developed essentially by Dr. Martin Seligman, who also has pioneered much of the research on positive psychology, something that I particularly like. And I'm just going to paraphrase because I don't remember the very detailed specifics of the experiment, but essentially what he did was have dogs in cages that were low enough that the animal could easily escape just by jumping out. So no problem for the dog to escape. However, in the beginning the dogs were harnessed. They were kind of locked into the cage. They couldn't get out just because of the harness. And then the cage had this electrical flooring or wiring that could accommodate current. And then some current was passed through the wiring, and it was uncomfortable for the dogs, and they were like I don't believe the dogs were suffering, I hope not, but they wanted to get out of the cage nonetheless, and they couldn't because of the harness. And this was repeated over multiple instances, and then eventually the harnesses were removed, and the current was reapplied, and the dogs would just sit there passively and endure the discomfort. And what had happened is that the dogs had actually learned through conditioning that nothing that they did mattered. There was no way of escaping that situation. Even though there was, they could easily leave at their own volition, like they just had to jump and they'd be free. And this is the essence of learned helplessness, is that when you are faced with adversity repeatedly and you can't overcome that adversity, you may start to just kind of give up and think like, this is hopeless. Which also, by the way, looks like depression, right? So you can see how situations like this with the baby and the mom, when they're repeated over and over again, can generalize into depression or depressive states. It's this idea that I'm useless, I'm hopeless, I'm inadequate. And anxiety and depression, almost like brother and sister emotions in a sense. They very frequently co-occur. And anxiety just being that expression of like, the world is just too dangerous, it's unpredictable, I'm not competent, I can't handle it. And then this is problematic when you grow up believing that if that thought is conditioned into you before you even really thinking, but that emotional intensity is there, those emotional memories are laid down very thick and deep in the brain. And then as thinking begins to develop, especially with children, they tend to internalize a lot of their conflict. So they may see parents fighting and then they may think like, this is somehow because of me. If I was a better kid, my parents wouldn't fight. And then on top of that, there's this expectation that they can't overcome their environment. They're too weak or fragile or frail. This will start to bias their thinking towards anticipating negative outcomes and anticipating failure. And that is like confirmation bias. It's like every time they fail, it's like, I told you you're going to fail. That little inner voice in their head is like, we knew you were going to fail, right? Because, that's what you always do. You always fail. And that reinforces the belief more and more and more, and it generalizes into different situations. And it really sets in. So, just to summarize that in short, ignoring the child communicates the message that the child is unimportant as she likely perceives it. And that feeling can stick for a long time, until the opposite way of thinking or behavior, which may come about through therapy, for example. And then ultimately the child grows up seeking the love that was missing from her parent and tries to find it in potentially damaging ways. And that's a topic for another video, but there is a really strong association between substance use of all kinds, or lump alcohol in with that category, and early childhood trauma or neglect. And also when I say childhood trauma, like we oftentimes think of sexual abuse or physical abuse, yelling, conflict in the environment. That's certainly true. However, I think there's also ample evidence that suggests neglect contribute to trauma. So kids feeling that they're constantly neglected, that their experience of being is invalidated, that it somehow does not make sense, and the kid struggles to form a coherent sense of identity because everything they say and do just seems like it's wrong. And then, like, how do they know what's right? Nothing feels right. Everything's enmeshed with conflict, as it were. So yeah, these things can definitely play into substance abuse. I don't say that these specific circumstances cause substance abuse, but they are contributory. Just as I don't think these circumstances cause anxiety and depression, but they are likely contributory. And I just wanted to highlight them because I think that from my observation, it seems like it's often neglected. If you go to typical websites, I don't want to mention names, but if you Google, for example, what causes anxiety and depression, and you see these sort of popularized mainstream health sites, and they may discuss the etiology of anxiety and depression, but I feel like I've observed a lot of times this type of discussion is often left out. And then I would just highlight one other thing that I think is useful information in understanding how the brain processes information and why prefrontal frontal regions of the brain are so critical to this. There's a well-known, in the neuroscience literature at least, and psychology, an example of an individual. His name is Phineas Gage. Interesting guy to read up on. who was working the railroads back in 1848 in the U.S., and when they were laying down track, they had to blast out holes in the ground to lay down the track on, and what that involved was digging out a hole and then packing dynamite into it, and then packing sand or mud or dirt debris on top of that so you could contain the blast, and the blast would widen the hole rather than just shooting straight up in the air. So it was a little bit of a dangerous pursuit, because what this guy was doing, he was compacting the material into the hole, and the tamping iron that he's using, which would be something analogous to a crowbar without the hook on it, was kind of like a metal rod with, I think, a sharp end. He was damping it down into the hole, and then something sparked, and it exploded while he was in this packing process, and the tamping iron basically became this missile projectile that shot out like a bullet out of the hole. Unfortunately, his head was in the way, and it struck him in the lower jaw and went through his head behind the eye socket and exited at the top of the skull. Took out about a fist-sized area of brain, and probably did a lot of other damage throughout the brain in areas that weren't directly hit. Just the way kind of traumatic brain injury and high impacts work, and then inflammation set in and so on. But what's interesting was that his character was described pre-accident as very stable, hardworking, good ethical, moral values, very easy to get along with, just a good all-around guy. And then subsequent to the accident, he reportedly underwent this character change where he became very grouchy, irritable, angry, not very productive at work. He wasn't able to continue working, or he became unreliable at least. He struggled to hold down a job, apparently became prone to fits of anger, just very difficult to get along with. But essentially they described him as an entirely different person. And a lot of that was emotional change. And some of it was change you might refer to as productivity, being able to function in a healthy way. And the parts of the brain that mostly relate to emotion and motivation were not damaged in the accident, not explicitly, because it was the frontal part of the brain that was damaged. And that was one of the first instances of clear evidence of how the frontal regions of the brain regulate the expression of emotion. So you might be angry, maybe you're angry at your boss, but you bite your tongue and you know, like, well, if I vent at him, I might lose my job. If I yell at my children, I might harm them, emotionally, whatever it is. You can feel the anger, but you can know how to restrain it. And that was the part of the brain that was damaged. And likewise, although brain circuitry that influences motivation mostly via the basal ganglia that connects to the emotional centers of the brain and kind of gives us the sense of emotion, motivation to do things in the sense of reward, that part of the brain seems like it was spared, but the parts of the brain that orchestrate regulation and planning and goal setting and kind of why you're doing this in the first place, that was damaged, and he became more apathetic about working. So it's just a little bit of insight into like how the brain is networked and how different areas of the brain, although you could compartmentalize them in some ways, they're very disconnected in other ways, in other respects. So sometimes it's almost, I think, in this situation, it's a little bit like the accelerator and the brake, where the accelerator may be emotional arousal, but the brake is inhibiting that arousal and maybe displaying emotion in a productive and an effective, socially acceptable manner. So that is the essence of it. It's a fairly brief explanation, but I think it's important. It just, like I said, seems to get it just seems like it doesn't get a lot of attention in terms of its importance in how anxiety and depression and other psychiatric and mood disorders can develop, because a lot of times anxiety and depression have comorbidities, like I mentioned, where they contribute to or evolve into substance use. I would say one last interesting thing is that my, albeit somewhat limited, but I've still got several years of clinical experience now. From what I've seen, a lot of times when I talk about to clients, to patients about their early childhood experiences, a lot of times they'll say, yeah, great parents, my parents were supportive, I had a good childhood. And I explain this to them, this concept. Suddenly like the lights come on and they go like, oh yeah, my parents were good parents, but they were also kind of emotionally absent a lot of the times. And I think this is not necessarily a criticism of parenting. It's more, I think, the society that we've created that tends to exert excessive, significant pressures on us for time, right? So a lot of families today, both parents work. There's traffic, is a big problem. People have to leave home early. They get home late. They've still got to make dinner, kind of unwind and decompress. It doesn't leave necessarily a lot of time for parents to spend with their kids and be fully present with them. And kids, like you can see in this video, are highly attuned to this. They notice it. And we kind of get by in many respects, but I think this is where a lot of the sort of societal level damage is happening with kids. And this incidentally can contribute, I think, also to ADHD, which is attention deficit, right? And so if a kid is repeatedly getting the message that they feel inadequate in some way or incompetent in some way, it becomes hard to process that. They don't have the cognitive ability to process it. So it's easier to just continually distract and like look for a new stimulus, like, oh, look, squirrel. Like it distracts you from the sort of restless, agitated, emotional something or another that feels off, and you can tell it's off, but you can't tell what it is. So, and I think there's other things that I'm sure pretty certain there are a lot of other things that contribute to ADHD, but this may be another one of those pieces in the puzzle. So hopefully that is useful. I think in practical terms, if you're raising a child, try to learn, or just with people in general, try to be emotionally very present. That's full engagement, active listening, act very interested, be gentle, validate the other person's experience. Try to understand where the other person is coming from, because this actually is a great approach just with resolving arguments. A lot of times I believe arguments stem from a deficit in listening and a deficit in trying to understand why the other person is feeling and expressing the way they are. If you can focus on that rather than what you say, it'll go a long way to minimize and assuage arguments. And what else is relevant on that topic? I think I'm running out. But essentially, one other thing I think is just recognizing the nonverbal cues, as I was saying. Like, you can say, like, I'm going to kind of make a joke about this because it's like a stereotypical marriage joke, but the guy says to the wife, like, you okay, honey? And the wife says, I'm fine. Okay, that was verbal, but there was a lot of tone there, but the facial expression matters, right? We know she's not fine. She may not say anything. She may say sweetly, I'm fine, but the facial expression says otherwise. And we just, like I said, that emotional radar inside of our mind is very sensitive. It's highly acutely tuned to the environment. So just know that when you do have conflict with other people, it's not necessarily about what's being said. It may be the nonverbals, like the eye rolling. That's a big red flag. Like that's a big trigger for a lot of people, right? Because it says, and not without saying, like you don't care what the person's saying, or what they're saying is stupid. Something like that. Very critical and judgmental. Shrugging your shoulders and turning your body around, like walking away without excusing yourself. Learning just, for example, like there is an example of learning how to communicate. I'm sorry, I feel stressed right now. Can we please talk about this a little bit later? Very different message than just turning your back on someone when they're talking, right? Which is a nonverbal and highly invalidating behavior. So I think I will leave it there. I think these videos also, in my mind, are going to be seeds planted in the ground for some watering and nurturing. In other words, that coming from feedback and comments. If there's something that you think would be helpful to elaborate on this topic or related to this topic, please comment or send me a message. I'm trying to make these videos useful at many levels, but that probably necessitates a lot of different videos. So if you have suggestions that relate to this or not, just let me know, and hopefully I can follow up. And final thing to say is, please remember these videos are intended as informational and educational. Please don't substitute this or take this as medical advice or something to replace what you are working with maybe with another healthcare professional, please consult with your licensed healthcare provider for your own personal treatment needs. And this is just information that you might find useful to explore around, and maybe to ask them about if you see a doctor for any kind of treatment. All right, until next time, see you later.